Dr. Robert Plomin is here with me again. It hasn't happened too many times in this podcast, so thank you very much again joining me and being available.
It's lovely to be back again. I really enjoyed our previous conversation.
Thank you very much. What can I say? I'm on the top, so I should stop maybe or put the podcast. Okay, as we ended that podcast, I want to have a short follow-up from that previous podcast because it was not recorded. I'm just telling to our audience it was not recorded in one, and I'm just cutting it too. But we had like almost 2 months before in between the two sessions, and some questions came up. And first of all, I'd like to cover 2 of them. Robert, the first one, I was speaking with some people who are more in cultural psychology, anthropology, and their way of thinking, I wouldn't say that 100% is the same as we were talking about. And this is, well, very fine-tuned, very subtle how I talk about this time. And I was thinking about if I'm grown, if I'm raised in a very different culture, for example, I don't know, in other part of the world, would I be the same person? Would I have the same beliefs, ideas about the world, my same narrative of the way life should go? And my answer would be not sure, or maybe very different. And maybe it could have then be connected to the behavior, because I would not behave 100% the same as I would behave, I don't know, in our, let's say, Western culture. So my question, I guess, to you, and I think you have my hints why I'm asking about, what do you think about this culture gene co-evolution? Can we talk about something like this? How are these things interconnected? What's your thought on this one? Because I'm sure I'm not the first person talking about these things with you. What do you think about that?
It's an important topic to discuss. It's why when we talked last time about the first half of my book, Blueprint, which is the first half is about DNA matters more than you think, basically. And I tried to emphasize, we're talking about, in my sort of genetics, about what makes us different, individual differences as they exist in a particular population. And I tried to distinguish that from what could be. So we're talking about what is.
Yeah.
There's genetic differences, there's environmental differences in our culture, and both of them can make people different. So to what extent does inherited DNA differences make you different? So that's individual differences, what is. Then there's a whole series of questions about what could be. If you were raised in a different culture, would you be different? That's what could be. It's not what is. And what is an important set of questions, because that is what is. That is our world. And we do know, if you were a part, I ended up last time by saying the thrust of these findings from the first half of the book is that if you had been picked up by the wrong parents in the maternity ward and raised in a different family, went to a different school, had different friends, had a different job, what we're saying is you would be essentially the same person you are now, because genes are the major systematic force making us who we are, given what is. And so when you say what could be, if you were raised in a different culture, you could bet you'd be different. We know for sure you'd speak a different language, right? Because that's for sure. But that what could be, you could say, right, but what if we made a few gene mutations? What if we edited your genome? Would you be the same person? No, you would be different. It could make a difference. It would make a difference, just like being raised in a different culture. So those aren't unimportant questions, but they're not about individual differences as they exist now, which is the question we're asking, about the 1% of our 3 billion base pairs of DNA that make us different. The 99% is what makes us human. And so if going beyond culture, you could say, what makes us human? There are certain characteristics that we share with most humans. When you step back and look at all of us, if you were ET coming from another planet, we probably all look pretty much the same, and a lot of that has to do with the 99% of DNA that makes us the same. but it has to do with the fact that we all share environments. We breathe oxygen. We need light. We need nutrients. Now, culture is kind of in between. It's not individual differences and it's not species differences,
Yes.
which is what evolution's about. It's about cultures. And can a culture as a whole make you different? Well, obviously it can, and it does, like in terms of languages. We speak languages differently. But these are two different levels of analysis. And it's just the levels of analysis, perspectives, like the species-wide level of evolution, or the group level of culture, or individual differences level, which is what I studied. They ask different questions and they need different methods to get at them. But they're not right or wrong. They're just different. And it's important you don't mix them up, especially the cultural level and the individual differences level. There's no necessary connection between any of these levels. So you can find something highly heritable at the individual differences level, say like language is one of the most highly heritable characteristics, in terms of vocabulary, verbal fluency, those sorts of individual differences measures are very highly heritable. But that doesn't mean at the species level, our language is due to genes. Now, most people would say, yes, it is. It evolved. That's why we're natural language users. But at the cultural level, we speak different languages. It's totally environmental, which language you speak.
Yes.
But in any culture, you can find individual differences that I predict will be highly heritable, because language differences between people are some of the most heritable cognitive traits. So these are different levels of analysis, not right or wrong, just useful or not for particular purposes.
Yeah, but language is, we may say, universal among humans. Reading, for example, is not, right? So it can be a big difference because there are lots of populations of humans who don't read, and even between different languages, there are very big differences, because in some languages you count like one too many, and with that, well, you cannot make a high level of physics or mathematics with that kind of language. So the differences can be, and when you talk about what could be, I'm connecting this to maybe to adaptation, because what is and difference between what could be, that's a very important distinction, but the what could be is maybe the source of our adaptation. So how can we adapt to different, I don't know, environmental challenges? Am I right?
Yeah. And I think that's the reason there's so much genetic variability in evolution. If things are really, really important, like frontal vision we talked about last time, our eyes are in the front of our head so we can see three-dimensionally. But the big cost is we don't see the lion behind us there.
Yes.
I suggest we're predators more than prey, because the prey, like rabbits, they can see 360 degrees around them.
Yeah, look at the lion, right?
Yeah. So that's something that's so important evolutionarily. It doesn't allow any important genetic variability. But as we said last time, if you look at visual acuity, you can find individual differences when you look for them. Individual differences in color vision, for example. But the other things, so by having, that's so important, there's no genetic variability. But for most other things, from height, weight, strength, probably personality, intelligence, it's not important that we all are the same. And I think genetic variability, naturally occurring mutations that build up, they're not selected out by natural selection, because sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, and it allows us to be more adaptable in different environments. There's different evolutionary strategies where some animals are bred to be very specifically attuned to one environment.
Yeah.
And as long as that environment's there, they're great. They'll reproduce, everything will be fine. But change the environment and they're screwed, because they don't have any
extinction. Yeah.
adaptability. And I think humans and some species that are commensal with us, like dogs, for example, and rats, yes, they're very adaptable. And I think that is probably genetic at a basic level as well, that we do have that genetic variability that allows us to be so different from one another. So I don't think these things are incompatible at all. So that's a long-winded answer to the question, but it's
no. I think it's okay. You know, when I wouldn't say I went reading in depth, but reading one or two books about, maybe I should not say the other side, but why I felt the other side, how these things were rephrased in these books, to be honest. And I felt it very human, that this is our tribe who believe in this, and this is our tribe who believe in that. And to be honest, I'm somewhere in between. I think all of these things are about one thing. So I don't have this. We talked about nature nurture question. We can ask, maybe there's a culture versus gene. I don't think there's a versus part in this one. These are these different levels, and sometimes I'm sad, you know, when I hear that some academics say things that I'm right, and it means that somebody else should be not right, you know. So we are not talking about something in general, because we are talking about humans.
Yeah. Could I add one thing to that, though?
Yeah.
What I love about behavioral genetics and this individual difference level of analysis is we have methods to address the question empirically. Twin, adoption, DNA studies allow us to ask to what extent do inherited DNA differences make a difference? And it also tells us quite a bit about the environment. Is the environment nurture, as we talked about last time? Is it due to growing up in a particular family? So it's empirically oriented. And as a scientist, I like tractable problems like that. Now, when you think about group level analysis, it's very hard to pin down the causes. Margaret Mead thought, oh, it's just all environment, you know, but now we know she was pretty much duped by the people she was talking to, you know, so it's really hard to come up with strong empirical tests of group differences. And that's why I stay away from group differences, not just cultures, but ancestral groups and even sex, because it's very hard to pin that down. So I'd rather stay with the empirical problem. Plus, I would say that individual differences are huge. So we don't need to go looking for other levels of group differences. But having said that, I would say, yeah, I understand cultural anthropologists, fine. You know, study the human at the species level, fine. That's 99% of our DNA. So that's all good. But just to be clear about the differences and the fact that you can't go from one level to the other, finding heritability of individual differences doesn't mean that group differences are going to be due to genetics.
Yeah. And I'm sure that all these things are interconnected, and our knowledge as well. We need some hundreds of years maybe to get into the depth of these things. Okay, the other question, it was connected, very different. Okay, so it's not culture, it's much more biology part, let's say. It's about microbiome. So I had a previous podcast with one of my friends who is doing research relating to microbiome and etc. And the question was, how much do we know, if we know anything about it, about the effects of the microbiome, the bacteria, viruses, fungi living in our cells? So the internal environment, if I can say, effects on our genes expression.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's the larger topic of gene expression, but the microbiome is especially interesting. It's amazing to think there are more cells in us that are not us, right?
Yeah, and very few people know that, to be honest.
Yeah, and this isn't one thing. These are millions of species in a way. I mean, it's incredibly complex. So that's just fascinating in itself. And to what extent does that make us who we are as individuals would be my question. And so far the answer is not very much in terms of behavior. I mean, suppose the microbiome was totally responsible for who you are, your personality. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't be heritable, would it? And the point to emphasize—
Thank you for that question. I'm not sure, because if they are connected through regulation, and the microbiome can regulate some part of our DNA, maybe yes, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, but the answer is no, and here's why. Because people misunderstand that what we're talking about with genetic heritability are inherited DNA sequences. And so we can find a DNA difference. We'll talk about SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. If that correlates with the behavior, then we don't have to know anything about what happens in between, because nothing changes your inherited DNA sequence.
Mhm.
And that's what we're talking about with heritability. Now, for genes to do their thing, they have to be expressed. But if it affects behavior, if it's associated with behavior, it had an effect. We don't know how it had the effect. It's expressed. If it weren't expressed, it couldn't make a difference. You see, so all genes have to be expressed to make a difference, but the expression has nothing to do with the inherited DNA differences, which is what we're calling heritability. It's a difficult point to get across. You know, people don't usually raise this issue of the microbiome. They usually raise the issue of epigenetics, but it's the same thing. Epigenetics is slow motion gene expression changes in development. Gene expression, though, happens on a second-by-second basis. That's what RNA is about. You know, with COVID, you hear about mRNA vaccines.
Yes.
That involved, the RNA is the messenger. The RNA evolved to be sensitive to the environment. DNA evolved to faithfully transmit your inherited, genome, what you inherited from your ancestors. So it's a really important distinction. And I know it's hard for people to get it really, but the main thing is that nothing changes your inherited DNA sequence. That is, you start life as a single cell with one set of DNA, half from your mother, half from your father. That DNA sequence that's uniquely yours is in every cell of your body throughout life. The only thing that happens is you sometimes get random mutations, but those are actually viewed as environmental because they aren't inherited DNA differences.
Mhm.
They make you different from yourself, but they're not that important. What's important is the fact that your inherited DNA sequence is the same in the first cell and in the trillions of cells in your body throughout life.
Mhm.
That's what we talk about as inherited DNA differences. Now, those inherited DNA differences to work, they have to go through RNA, they have to go through proteins, brain, all the other mechanisms in the body to have their effect. But we can go all the way from the inherited DNA differences to behavior without knowing anything about what happens in between. Now, of course, as a scientist, I'm interested in gene expression. I'm interested in epigenetics, the microbiome, everything else that can have an effect can be part of this pathway between genes and brain and behavior. But none of those things are changing your inherited DNA sequence.
But maybe the question would be right the other way around. So is it connected much more to our genes? What kind of microbiome we have? So if you think like this.
Yeah, well, that could be. There's some suggestion that where do we get our microbiome? You'd think kids growing up in the same family would share the similar germs or whatever, you know, the food. But it hasn't been studied very much yet. You know, we're still thinking about the microbiome in this, we call it nomothetic way, you know, average effects for everybody. But genetics is everywhere. So I wouldn't be surprised if some species of microbiome like your genes system better than my gene system, and maybe they flourish better in your system than my system. But I don't think we know about that much at all yet. You could imagine doing a twin study of this, couldn't you? To what extent do identical twins have more similar microbiomes than fraternal twins? I don't think we know.
Yeah, interesting question, because when I started to read just for some moments about this topic, and I saw there's a connection between your King's College, London, and Max Planck Institute working together on this field. So maybe my next guess is going to come from that field, because I'm very interested in this one. But let's close this part, because I think it's interesting, but maybe we should stop with this one. Okay, let's get to this DNA revolution, the second part of your book. Where's the revolution? I'm looking out my window and see.
Yeah.
So,
well, when I was asked to write my book Blueprint 30 years ago, I didn't want to do it because we were in the middle of doing a lot of research in the first.
30 years ago, you said 30?
I was asked to write it initially 30 years ago and said I wouldn't because I was so involved in the research at that time, that I wanted to just keep my head down. I was also chicken because at that time it would have been very dangerous, really, professionally at least, to talk about what I wanted to say in Blueprint. Okay, so we went through that last time. And then I thought, that would be a good career. I mean, I had done a lot of stuff. I felt really good about what we learned. And as you said, those are big findings, many of which people still don't really get some of the things we talked about last time. But then along came the DNA revolution in the 90s. Everybody knows that about 2000, the Human Genome Project came through, where we know most of the 3 billion base pairs of DNA. It took 20 years and 250 investigators. It was a huge project to come up with the human genome sequence. But the first thing, the neat thing about that blue skies research, people didn't know why they wanted to do it. It just seemed like the obvious thing to do scientifically. And most of the things that have come out of it, we hadn't anticipated. And the first thing that came out of it is there is no human genome sequence. Everybody has very different genome sequences.
We have, but not the same, right?
Yeah, well, 99% of the base pairs are the same, but 1% are different, and that's millions of DNA base pair differences. So at that point, then it became clear we could begin to use these DNA differences to find genes responsible for ubiquitous heritability. Up until then, there were no DNA markers. There were no variants in DNA itself. All we had were classical markers, like blood markers, the blood types.
Yes.
Those aren't DNA. Those are genetic in the sense that they're single gene traits. So you can use them as markers for genes, but they weren't DNA differences. But now with this DNA sequence and the DNA differences between people, you could find millions of DNA differences between us. And then if you could only measure them, you could then relate them to behavior. So the first sequence cost billions of dollars, but that one in 2003. But now a technological revolution made it possible to do this very cheaply. Instead of sequencing all 3 billion base pairs of DNA, there was something called a SNP chip, a DNA array, where on something the size of a postage stamp, you can measure hundreds of thousands, up to 1 million of these DNA differences for each individual very cheaply and quickly.
So technology is a very important part of this.
Technology made the DNA revolution, without doubt. And then once we had that capability, then it became possible to do what people only dreamed about since the late 1990s, and that was genome-wide association. Not looking for the one gene, which is all we could do previously, but to say we recognize there will be many, many genes involved in heritability of complex traits, not just behavior, but all the common medical disorders are like this too. They're not single gene disorders. They're all heritable, but they're not due to one gene. So by using the SNP chip, which now costs about 50 euros, something like that, all in. We've got to get your DNA. You get the DNA cheaply, as you know from COVID, by scraping the inside of your cheek. You get a little bit of DNA. And the second technological advance was called the PCR, polymerase chain reaction. Terry Mullen won the Nobel Prize for this. It's one of those fine. It's not as technologically advanced as, say, the DNA sequencing or any of that, but the PCR allows you to amplify DNA, and you can just take any little bit of DNA and make millions of copies, because you make one copy and then you make one copy of each of those, one copy of each of those, and that's the PCR from the PCR test. It allows you to take one little bit of the virus's DNA and amplify it to be millions of copies, so that you can then read it on something like those little tests that we have, where
because of COVID, lots of people we have heard of PCR, but not really. I don't think that most of them are familiar with what's in the background of this one.
Yeah. So and it's totally brilliant then. But instead of amplifying that one little bit of DNA that's a signature of the SARS virus for COVID. Now we're going to take your DNA, chop it up, all 3 billion base pairs, chop it up in little bits, amplify certain bits that we're interested in, and then see if you've got on this little bit, say 30 base pairs of DNA, do you have this form or do you have that form? And it's very reliable. And I could go on about it, but what's so cool about it is it made it kind of available for everybody. You don't find a biology lab that doesn't have these PCR machines and these machines to detect, we call them SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. It's the simplest sort of DNA difference and the most common. We all have millions of these. So we can detect them and then do an association study, not with one gene, like one blood type, but with all the genes across your genome. We can tag all the DNA differences across the genome. So that's called genome-wide association.
Yeah.
So that's what made the real DNA revolution, because now we can find genes even when there are thousands of genes that affect a trait, but you need huge samples to do it. We could go into that, but it's I don't know if your listeners know about the multiple testing problem. You know, to get significance levels and P levels, you assume that you're testing a specific hypothesis. But what if we're testing a million hypotheses? That is,
when technology comes in again, I think it's important.
It's big data, basically. But it just says that you're expecting very small effects. So most scientists know for small effects, you need much bigger samples. Yeah. And then if you have small effects and you have to correct for a million multiple tests, instead of the standard P of 0.05, which means you're willing to accept one false result out of 20, it's P of 0.05 with 7 zeros in front of it. And to do that, then you need samples in the hundreds of thousands to detect these small effects. So that's what's been happening in the last 10 years, and it's been very successful.
Yeah, but, well, I want to talk about this part. So we have technological advancements, so in different levels, PCR and what you just mentioned. What can we, I mean, of course, the scientists and everyday people learn out of this? Where are we heading now? Because obviously these are not just one field. We will talk about a little bit gene editing because we need to talk about that one. But before that, so what does it mean for us?
Yeah, well, something like 30 million people have paid out of their own pocket to have this testing done. Because what these SNP chips can give you is ancestry. So that's the thing a lot of people are interested in. And it's fascinating, isn't it, to realize we're all mongrels. We're all mixes of lots of different things. You know,
yeah, there are some interesting things about this on the internet, because there are companies who are working and talk about ancestry. I don't know how important is that, or is it that important, but maybe it's getting us more together if we want to get together, because it's another question.
I think that's right. That we're all related to each other if you just go back surprisingly few generations, you know. But also you find out you're not the pure Czech that you think you are, or Hungarian.
Or whatever, because it's very different thing. Your nationality and your background, I think, usually obviously here in Hungary, we are so many people. Also the Turkish were here for 150 years. So we have lots of things. We even can see it in our language, because with the words we use. So obviously our genes should be a big mixture.
Yeah. And it could be, you know, some people say evolutionarily, that's a great strength. The more mixture of DNA that you have, this, you know, we talked about the importance of this variability. It's sort of like money in the bank from a DNA point of view. Well, I think the more you mix groups like that, you probably get more variability, which means you get one end as well as the other end of the distribution, but it can be good, you know? So anyway, ancestry is one reason why people do it, but the other reason is the medical side. So 23andMe is one of the biggest companies, but they provide ancestry. Some people just go for ancestry with ancestry.com, for example, but with 23andMe, they give you some of the most important single gene disorders. Now that's really important. You get that out of these SNP chips. So you can measure.
Let's make it clear. What's a single gene disorder? Because I think
Yeah.
it's very important when we
It
go to
is
the next
very
level.
important. When people think about genetics, they learned about it from Mendel. Mendel studied single gene disorders in pea plants.
Yes.
So if you get one of these so-called recessive genes where you need two copies that Mendel studied, if you were a pea plant, your seeds, if you got two copies of this recessive allele, they'd all be wrinkled. They wouldn't be these nice round seeds. As long as you get one dominant allele, form of that gene, you'll have round, smooth seeds. It's deterministic and hardwired. It's necessary and sufficient. That's the definition of a single gene disorder.
You know, my way of thinking, my field is that people usually think of genetics that everything is a single gene.
Exactly right. That's my point. They learn about it from Mendel. So when you say genetics, you can say many, many genes involved, but they don't get it. They just think, well,
The gene for your braveness, the gene for your whatever.
And that's our bête noire with journalists. You tell them over and over again. Now, we found genes related to X, schizophrenia. You say, but please don't make the headline, the gene for. Because it's not a gene. There are many, many genes of small effect, which it's not semantic. There's a lot of important implications of understanding this properly. And but the worst bit is that when people think about genes as deterministic, they're thinking about single gene disorders. Now, there are thousands of them in humans, like people may have heard about Huntington's disease. That's a single mutation on the tip of chromosome 4 that the American folk singer Woody Guthrie died from. So that means it's dominant. So his son, Arlo Guthrie, this other folk singer, has a 50% chance of having that. And these are necessary and sufficient. If you get that mutation, you will die from Huntington's. It's a weird one in that it doesn't kill you before birth or at birth or early in life, as many of the single gene mutations do. It kills you later in life, after the reproductive years, which is why evolution hasn't screened it out, even though it's a horrible disease.
Because you still can't have your siblings. Yeah.
20 years of neural degeneration. But it will kill you unless something else kills you first. It doesn't matter what your environment is. There's nothing else that can prevent that gene from doing its thing. So it's necessary and sufficient. Now that's the way, as you said, people think about with genes when you say genetic. But the important point to realize is when you then take the step of saying, Mendel was right, that's how genes work. But if you have many genes, actually just more than 3 or 4, let alone 300 or 3,000, they each have small effects, and then they work probabilistically. So they don't determine, they're not hardwired, they influence your behavior. But it's such an important distinction, and it's just hard, I think, for most people they want to think black and white, don't they,
Yeah, well, much more easier, come on.
It is, exactly right, yeah. So it's a really important distinction that we're talking about probabilistic influences, not predetermined programming of a single gene necessary and sufficient. So
this will not sell a newspaper, right?
Yeah, and you'll always end up with it turns out, I understand that the journalists don't write the titles. There's certain other people who specialize in eye-catching sort of headline stories. So they're the ones who write the gene for.
Yes. But in the end, this is just a product, and we are not talking about, of course, newspapers, etc. But I think it's very important because when we talk about the knowledge, and this podcast is also meant to be not just for myself, but for our listeners here in this country and worldwide. So we need to get some basic things about this one. And when you talk about Huntington's disease, it's very small percentages of any diseases that are connected just to one gene. Am I right? The biggest part is thousands of genes.
Yep, but there are thousands of single gene disorders. And when you do 23andMe or one of these others, they'll tell you about the sort of most common ones, like Huntington's. But the scariest one they'll tell you about, as you're saying, they're all very rare. But if you had this gene for Huntington's, and I know several people who do, it's a very big thing. It changes your life, obviously. And the one that's scariest is that there's a gene for Alzheimer's disease called ApoE4. And it's not a single gene disorder. There are many, many genes involved. But unlike most of these disorders, There's one gene, apolipoprotein E, which is involved in cholesterol transport in the brain, that has a big effect. And to give how big an effect? Well, if you had, it's recessive, meaning you need 2 copies of it to show the effect. If you had 2 copies of it, first of all, people might be surprised that at 80, we all have about a 10% risk of having Alzheimer's. It's a very common disorder. But if you have 2 copies of this, you have over a 50% risk. And that's not 100%, but as medical risks go, it's a lot. It's a lot. And if you take these tests, you will find out if you have that risk. Now, only 1% of the population will have that double whammy, but still.
That's not only 1%, it's quite a big number, to be honest.
A lot of people. And so because they recognize how life transforming this is, because right now, even if you knew that risk when you were 10, there's nothing yet that can be done to alleviate that risk. I think there will be eventually. But so 23andMe now, if you took 23andMe, it costs about 150 euros or something. If you want to get that information, you have to say, yes, I've read this material you gave me, and yes, I do want to know my results for that. And then when the results come back, it's called a triple lock. You have to say again, yes, I understand this. And yes, I understand you're not going to sue them for this information. But in fact, you don't get much advice. You give some links to websites, for Alzheimer's societies and that sort of thing. But this is really big information for people.
They are the messengers.
Yep. But it's you say, well, why would you want to do it? And it's part of knowing yourself. This isn't a particularly nice one to know. Most of the time when people do this and you find out about the hundreds of mutations that you could have, you'll find out you don't have any of them. So that's good news. Most people will find that out because they're very rare. Now, most of them are recessive though. So I think one of the most important things about this, and the reason why I think eventually we all have to have this DNA testing done, is because carriers for single gene disorders that are recessive, and 95% of all these major mutations are recessive. That is, you're a carrier if you have 1 copy of them, but to show the disorder, you need 2 copies. Now, most of the time, if you have 2 copies, it's bad, and natural selection would get rid of it. But many, many more times, this allele is hidden in carriers. And carriers don't know they have it, like sickle cell anemia, for example, and many of the thalassemias, for blood sorts of disorders. So here's what's important about it is Ashkenazi Jews about 10 years ago, they have Tay-Sachs disease, which is a single gene recessive disorder that happens to have arisen in Ashkenazi populations back in the Middle East. And so they're much more likely to be carriers for this. And it kills you early in life. It's a horrible disease. Kids start out looking okay, and then they go through this neural degeneration, and it's just horrible, and they die very early in life, and nothing you can do about it. So they decided they would screen for it, because if you mate with someone who has this, you're both carriers, but you don't know that. You usually don't know it until you have a kid who's affected. Because if you think about it, you each have 2 copies, one from your mother, one from your father. If you're both carriers, what's the probability that your offspring will be affected? And you can quickly work that out in what's called a Punnett square. Say 25%. 50% of your offspring will be carriers. And then 25% won't have any copy of the mutation. But 25% of them will. And so the Ashkenazi Jews who arrange marriages anyway, they say, I think this
they decided before. It's not you.
But they threw this into the mix, and they drastically cut down on the number of Tay-Sachs. Because if the woman you wanted to mate with, Mary, you were both carriers. Now, you could say, I'm willing to accept that risk. I'll take my 25% chance. Or you could do in vitro fertilization, which is what most people do, and screen out the embryos that have a double dose of that mutation. And if we do that for a lot of people, Like George Church at MIT offers free genome sequencing to couples who are going to get married to tell them about this so that they know they're both carriers for this particular mutation. And they have to decide then, what do they want to do? I mean, they don't have to have kids. They could adopt kids. They could go through in vitro fertilization. But with one generation, you could cut out most single gene recessive disorders.
So with taking into consideration this knowledge, with your decisions, you can affect if these diseases will come up or not in the later generations. So.
And they're very rare, but if there are thousands, there are about, some people say 7,000, it depends. There's some are so rare you don't even know they exist, really.
Yeah.
But if you take the most common ones, say 5,000 or so, if we screen for those, your chances of having any of those mutations is low, but on average, you'll have 4 of those. You'll be a carrier for 4. Now, you're going to mate with somebody, she has a chance of having 4. The chances that these are the same ones are very low, right?
Yeah, okay, but it's you kind of dating what I foresee here, like because we didn't have this knowledge before.
That's right. But you know, when people go on about how awful this is, the sky's going to fall, we're going to have designer babies, DNA mating, you know, which is something that's happening. There are websites, DNA romance, that sort of thing. But this part of it could be incredibly valuable. It's said it costs $1 trillion a year, you know, these single gene mutations, which you didn't find out about until you had a kid with this recessive disorder. And then you'd say, what happened? And you'd say, well, you're both carriers for this disorder. And so at that point, then you'd think very carefully about having another child.
Absolutely. No, I think no question. And we should go, I think, for the next level, because with single gene disorder, nothing is black or white, but it's much more closer to being something black or white. And the decision making, the basis of our decisions, I can understand more, you know?
Okay, right.
But what about the next level when we have probability?
Yeah, well, that's where the DNA revolution hits the behavioral sciences as well as the medical sciences. Because although these single gene disorders are very dramatic and important, they're very rare. Most of the burden in our society, medically, as well as psychiatrically, are not like that. They're due to disorders like obesity, heart attack, cardiovascular diseases. These are not single gene disorders. They're influenced by heredity.
These are sometimes not diseases at all. What you're talking about.
Right, they're disorders. They're, I think, dimensions. You know, most of cardiovascular risk, risk for alcoholism, I even think schizophrenia, we're talking about quantitative, more or less risk rather than either or qualitative risk. But the point is that these disorders are very different from the deterministic hardwired single gene mutations. They're probabilistic propensities. They increase your risk. So with heart disease, and what we're able to do with these genome-wide association gene chips is not just find the one mutation, but we can look at thousands of DNA differences and create what we call a polygenic risk score. That is multiple genes. And we're not talking about 10 or 20. We're talking about adding up your risk across thousands of these tiny DNA differences and predicting, say, your cardiovascular risk or your risk for schizophrenia or reading disability. Really everything in psychology now, we've done these genome-wide association studies, and you can begin to predict people's propensities for these dimensions or disorders. So with cardiovascular risk, for example, you can say 5% of the population is running around with at least a 10-fold greater risk of having a very severe heart attack.
Mm-hmm. And with that knowledge, we can decide how to live. So this is where, or it's not a good way of thinking, because it means that if we have this kind of knowledge, it's not 100%, it's not 0, but if you talk about, I don't know, weight or cardiovascular things like this, and that your polygenic score says this, that you have 60% or 70% probability of, I don't know, getting more weight than an average person. So maybe you have to design your way of life. Am I right?
Exactly right. My highest polygenic risk score is for obesity.
I know, that's why I'm mentioning this one. You wrote it in your book.
Exactly. You know, people say, oh, well, then you just give up. You say, I'm a genetic fatty, you can't do anything about it. But to the
It's just will. Why don't you decide, right?
Right. Why don't you just have willpower and stop eating? For skinny people, it's easy to say. You know, like I have allergies too that I developed from working with mice. And people, even who don't have allergies, they think, oh, you know, it's just all in the mind, you know. But it isn't. It's real. I mean, you could bring a piece of paper in that was in a mouth flap, and suddenly my eyes will go red. I won't be able to breathe. You know, it's a real thing. And so is obesity.
From what allergy? What kind of allergy we're talking about?
Oh, when I was in graduate school, my first studies were with mice because with mice you can control genes and environment. But back then we had no health and safety. And so as a graduate student, I was given a closet, basically, an airless closet to breed my mice and to do my experiments. And so it's said in those conditions, 50% of us would develop severe allergies to mice.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so I did. So I had to, but that was great though, because it stopped me working with mice.
Yeah.
So that was that. But you know, with obesity, it doesn't mean I can't do anything about it. But first, it means I've got to recognize I've got a lifelong battle. You know, it isn't just a little bit of willpower. Those of us who have a tendency to put on weight and find it hard to get rid of it, maybe have more willpower, but it's just all of us get weak sometimes. Late at night, you're tired. There's a bag of potato chips in the cupboard talking to you, and you say, I'll just have one. And then
just one, right?
You know, so it means you have, as you said, you have to arrange your environment differently. I just don't have junk food in the house, you know, problem solved in a way. Sometimes
then you're angry with your wife. Why didn't you buy something?
Well, she's okay about it too. She doesn't want me to be fat. So yeah, so it's a good point. And really the larger point though is all of medicine is moving away from the medical illness model where you wait till someone has a heart attack and then you try to fix it. Instead, they're moving towards prevention. And to prevent, you've got to predict. And the best early warning system we have is DNA because it doesn't change from the moment of birth. And that allows you to intervene early because the best interventions are early. So if you knew your kid has a strong genetic risk for, say, cardiovascular disease, what you would do is what we're all supposed to do, low-level, low-tech sorts of things. Just watch the diet.
Not making him eating bacon for sure, right? A lot, yeah.
Watch the weight. You know, we're all supposed to do that. Exercise, you know. But if you know, like me, you're at genetic risk for this, which has a lot of medical implications, you know, diabetes for one, for example, and now even cancers, people say, you know, you're more motivated to pay attention to those messages and, you know, cut down on your weight. But it's actually easier with kids and young people if you just start out that way. It's a lot harder, you know, with obesity and alcoholism and schizophrenia. Once people have these diseases full blown, it's much harder to fix them. Really, we're not all that good at it, you know? So it's much better if we can prevent these problems from occurring initially. And that's what DNA is good for. So all the medicine is moving that way. And I think the behavioral sciences will too. They'll begin to recognize that if you can predict some of these problems, we can then...
You know, it just made me think that we humans, well, I guess we humans, we need some kind of triggers. When I have the pain, you know, some people go to the dentist before they have any problems, but I'm not a dentist, but my friends who are dentists tell me that most of the people go there because they have a pain in their mouth, right? Talk about prevention, and I'm not sure whether our human psychology is very good at that.
But if you start thinking about DNA as an early warning system, you say, okay, you're not experiencing these initial sort of heart attack feelings, but you've got the DNA and it says, look, you're really at high risk for this. Now, we don't want to scare you. It doesn't mean you will die from a heart attack. But wouldn't it just make sense not to wait till you have angina before you start to do something about it and then need a triple bypass? Why not? Think about it earlier and then monitor it as well. You know, you can do whole body scans now where you can see that these arteries are starting to get fuzzy. You don't have to wait till they clog up and you start getting angina, you know, these pains in your chest. Why not? And so I think that's the way it'll go. When some people, you know, say, by doing that, I avoided having a triple bypass and or a heart transplant, let alone, you know.
Oh my
And
God,
so,
but this is a very new knowledge. This is something we haven't known for thousands of years, I mean, as a
yeah,
species. And now we have, you wrote it also in your book, that we have a, I don't know, I don't remember the exact phrase, like Iron Age psychology or something like this.
yeah, we evolved it with an Stone Age brain
Sorry.
in a modern fast food nation.
What about this Stone Age brain and the polygenics course? This is my question. So because I think fear is not always a bad thing to have fear, because it's better to have a fear than die, you know. So,
Yeah.
but I have a question. I don't have really answer to this one because I'm not sure that it's really good for everybody, and how we can handle this kind of knowledge, you know. What your
Well,
way of thinking about it?
yeah, I wrote the book because I wanted to give DNA people the DNA, the second half of the book, to give them the DNA literacy they need to talk about these issues, to understand them, to realize we're not talking about single gene deterministic traits. We're talking about probabilistic propensities. People don't like probabilities. You know, they talk about, I want zero risk. There's nothing in life that's a zero risk, right? It's all probabilities. And we've just got to get used to the fact that life is a set of possibilities and probabilities. There's nothing certain in life. So I think we got to get used to this idea that, you know, like when I talk to public audiences, for example, I use the example of Alzheimer's as kind of one of the worst examples here. And I say, who would want to know if they're in that 1% of the population who has a 50% chance of having Alzheimer's? But, and it's interesting. I don't know what you think, but it's usually with you know, a typical intellectual public audience, you know, people who read about
It's
science.
important to emphasize.
About half will say, yes, I do want to know. And half will say, no way do I want to know. But if you ask those who don't want to know, they'd say the obvious thing, well, there's nothing we can do about it. It would just ruin my life. Now, many of these things we've been talking about, cardiovascular disease, obesity, alcoholism, you can definitely do stuff about it. But with Alzheimer's, you can't even do anything about it. So what about the half that says, yes, I do want to know, which is where I would put myself. And that's because I want to understand myself. Knowledge is power. And even though there's nothing you can do now about it, you can actually do something about it. If you knew you were at this very much higher risk of having Alzheimer's when you were in your 80s, you'd do something about it. You'd set your life up economically to be able to take care of that. You'd probably set yourself up socially. You'd set up some sort of conditions that you could take care of yourself when you were later in life. But the other thing you probably do, I know I do, is carpe diem. I try to live more for today. I'd say, I'm not going to wait till I'm in my 80s. I'm not going to take that chance. I'm going to live more of my life now. That wouldn't be so bad.
Robert, I cannot, but if I look to the near future, if this knowledge will be available really widely, I can imagine health insurance companies, for example, if you don't want to know that, you pay more because you decided not to know this information, which is important, and maybe you have to pay much more because of your negligence. How should I say? So I can imagine that our institutions will be different because of that.
I think it's the end of insurance. I think it really does require that we have a public health system where you distribute the risk and you don't make the decisions on the basis of money. You know, these insurance companies make huge amounts of money. And if they found out that you had a high genetic risk for having a heart attack, are they going to insure you? Well, as you say, maybe they would if they charge you 100 times more for it. But that's why in the United States, they said they're not allowed to find out that information. But if you knew you had that risk and you insured yourself for a lot of money, that wouldn't be fair either. I mean, I'm not, you know, fair to the insurance companies. I mean, it does seem to me, it takes like our national health system in the UK, instead of it being an anachronism from the 1940s after the Second World War, I think it's the way of the future to distribute that risk very broadly across the population, to have organizations like NICE, our National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which makes these tough decisions. They say, okay, for this disease, you know, with all these modern technologies coming up, you cannot do everything for everybody. Somebody has to say, this new drug is not cost effective. We cannot afford to give you 10,000 euros a month for this because it only improves your lifespan by 6 months.
Hard
and
decisions.
the quality of life isn't that. These are tough decisions because, you know, it's the commons versus the individual. I mean, it's your life. And if you can live 6 months more, you might say, I don't care what it costs. I want to do that. But, you know, you got to say from a societal point of view, someone's got to be making these tough calls. And genetics is going to fit into this. And especially when we say, if we start preventing these disorders rather than waiting till they happen, you know, like it said that a severe heart attack costs 700,000 euros all in by the time you do the operations. And that's not even to mention the quality of life. You know, people's lives aren't as good after
and the connection with all on the family, etc. Because it's much more complex than that. So,
yeah. But then if you had a national health system, you're motivated to prevent disorders. Do you know the weirdest thing about insurance companies is they get paid by hospitals. You don't go to the hospital till you have the disorder. So in a way, you could say insurance companies are motivated not to prevent disorders. I mean, there's nothing financially in it for them to prevent a disorder. They only make money by hospitals paying, you know, them paying off hospitals.
I understand. Basic, very important questions. What do you think? How much do we actually, out of these polygenic scores now in 2023, what do you think, how big is our knowledge concerning all the medical, I don't know, diseases or majority of them? Do we have this information or we are just in the very beginning of this one?
Well, it's only been going on for 10 years, which is a very short time, you know, in terms of big advances like this. And given that amount of time, I think the progress has been amazing. But say cardiovascular disease is maybe 40, 50% heritable. It's, you know, these complex disorders are not more heritable than most of our behavioral disorders.
Yes.
So that's the most you're going to predict is 40 or 50% of the liability. And of that, we're only predicting, say, 10% of the liability. So that's called missing heritability. We're not yet explaining all of the genetic variants, but that 10%, you start matching it against, people say, oh, it's just 10%. But, you know, in terms of predictive power, there aren't a lot of other things that predict much better than that. For example, with cardiovascular, you know, weight predicts, but, you know, there's a lot of very heavy people who don't have heart problems, and there's a lot of skinny people who have heart problems. None of these things are perfectly predictive. So we can already predict using these polygenic scores, and you'd be silly not to use it as a supplementary prediction. You don't want to say this is the only thing we'll use to predict, but the difference is you can predict from early in life, whereas none of these other predictors allow you to predict from early in life.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's really a very exciting new area. It's really relatively just starting, but it's happening. And these polygenic scores you're beginning to see in direct-to-consumer companies, we call them, like 23andMe. They do now have a polygenic score for body mass index. You can see why they want to avoid it in a way, because the single gene stuff is just black or white. And even that people have trouble understanding, you know, if they're a carrier or what's the risk for their offspring having these things. So that's tough enough. But then when you're dealing with these probabilistic propensities, you know, like for complex medical and behavioral disorders, it's just so much harder for people to understand.
I would think that it should be educated very early on, because it's the same for history, for everything.
Yeah.
Whatever we are taught in the school, and if this kind of way of thinking is there, maybe it can help. So because with this polygenic score, we are talking about so many things, but it comes to me, but if you are preventive, what bad you can do with your life. So it's much more safer to be on this side than on the other side here. So here comes the big question. If somebody listening to this podcast says, okay, where can I go? Are there thousands of companies who can do for me this kind of polygenic score, not just the single gene disorder ones, but are these available in every country? Maybe I'm missing, but when I walk here in Budapest, I don't see every other corner a company who is selling me this service.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think the way it should go is National Health Services will begin to do it. And in Estonia and Finland, if you go into the hospital, they'll ask if you want to have your DNA testing done. Because if you get blood, it's a cheap thing. Of all the medical tests they do, even basic, PSA thing, getting your DNA chip done is a relatively cheap thing. And you do it once, and that's the information for all of these hundreds of polygenic scores that you can create. So that's happening, and the NHS now has an £80 million pilot project to do this in the UK as well. So that's going to happen. Question is, though, you're not going to get, how much information are you going to get? And in some ways, they might say, well, we'll give you the actionable information, like maybe alcoholism. Because if you don't drink a lot of alcohol, you're not going to become alcoholic. Now, if you have a high polygenic score, it doesn't mean you're going to become alcoholic. But it means you're more at risk for that. So why ignore this information? Some people do, they just want to pretend this doesn't exist. But smart people will say, okay, well, I'll put that in the wheelhouse and keep it in mind, So, but right now, that's still relatively slow. National Health Services, they're not going to give you the information about psychological sorts of traits. I don't know that they'll give you information about Alzheimer's or schizophrenia. So you say, but it's my DNA, I want to know. So I think that's an argument to be had. I mean, to what extent ought you to be able to find out if you want to? But you can find out today by going to one of these direct-to-consumer companies. And there are hundreds of them.
Like 23andMe, that's what you mentioned.
And there's a lot of specialty ones, like ones that specialize in things like athletics. That's a hot topic. There's actually quite a few about horses, because horse racing, as well as elite athletics, a 1% difference can make all the difference. If you think about a racehorse, for example.
Polygenic score of the horse?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
The Dog Genome Project is very big. But with humans, there are many of these companies, and for some reason, a lot in Southeast Asia and mainland China as well. And you know what the big thing now is, scary? It's to market to parents of young children to have their children tested for DNA to find out their strengths and weaknesses, their talents. And I think partly what this is about in China, when they went to the one-child policy, from having lots of kids to one child, people thought, well, I've got to do everything possible for this one kid. So I think that's what it's about. But it's also a weird culture in the sense that they would still, until not too long ago, they would look at horoscope signs as a way of matching couples, And so if you're going to take weird information like that, it's not crazy to think about taking DNA information. So anyway, there are a lot of these companies, but there's, I think about 4 or 5 of them do about 90% of the business. But what's happening now are these specialty companies, I started to say, athletics, nutrition, for example, and cosmetics. I guess cosmetics is such a big area, and some women are allergic to particular types of cosmetics, for example. So you could screen for that and tell a woman, look, you want to avoid this type of cosmetic and you want to do that. Or your skin is particularly susceptible, it will be invigorated by this type of drug.
Well, these are commercial reasons. So they are coming from the business side segment and not of the academia, what we're talking about now. And it's okay for me to some part, but still not that okay if I think of our national, I don't know, health company here in Hungary or in whatever country. So So we don't really have now, I don't know, companies in each and every country that can give you the right amount of information about your polygenic score.
Well, these are all international companies.
Mhm.
So you could send to 23andMe. Some countries, Germany and France, don't allow, if you were in France, you wouldn't be allowed to use these companies.
Okay.
I don't know why, but you can't.
It's law. It's a different story. It's cultural thing.
But everyone gets around it. Just you can just have someone in Belgium, you know. So they still do it. So these are international companies. You don't need your own company, but if you had a company in your country, you could get a better match to your genotype. So on these SNP chips, we take DNA variants that work across a lot of the world. You know, they were designed from, like, I think 75 different ancestral groups because they do differ genetically. And but the farther you get away from they're mostly Northern European because that's where the genetics work was done. So being in Central Asia, you're probably right in the heart of the DNA variation. But as you get farther away from that into Africa and China, you get less predictive polygenic scores. And so what's going on in China and Southeast Asia is to have these large genome projects done in those countries. But where you are in Central Europe, you don't need it. You know, because most of the work is done in Northern European.
Close enough.
Close enough. That's right. So you don't need your own company in your
Maybe
country.
internationally, or maybe European Union wide. Okay, Britain is now, Brexit is again outside, I would say Europe. But on the European Union level, I can imagine companies like this, because we are not in America, we are a little bit different, I think, maybe genetically, but also I don't want to go into the depth, the differences in races, because it's again a different question. So what I wanted to tell you, maybe just one thing, what's your idea on that one? If you think of placebo effect, when you don't know something, and because you don't know that you eat placebo, there's an effect in your brain, in your way. And I'm thinking this non-placebo effect, when you have the knowledge, because of having the knowledge, how this can affect your way of thinking and behavior, you know where I'm going with this one. So I'm not always sure that it's always good to know. And I am that type of person who always wants to know the answers, but I'm not sure that it's always good to know the answers. For example, today I had some cancer cells being killed by my immune system, but I don't know that if it's been 125 or 76. And if I don't know this, well, maybe it's good for me not to know that. What do you think of this knowing or not knowing debate, if there's such?
Well, again, this is a matter of values more than anything, I suppose. But I value individual rights, and I think there are big individual differences. And some people like me, I want to know everything about myself, good or bad, and I'll take the bad with the good. And as I said, even with Alzheimer's, the worst example you can use, I still want to know, even though there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah.
And I can understand people who say, no, they don't want to know. Their psyche can't, they just don't want it to mess up their life now. That's right. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So I don't know, there are individual differences on it, but I come down on individual rights basically, and it's my DNA. So why can't I learn as much about it as I wish? And, a lot of people won't want to know anything about it. Okay, that's their business. But as more and more of these advantages come through, people will say, what about us? And that's why some groups like Black populations, for which we don't have good genome information, and because we all evolved from Africa, they're kind of the originators of a lot of the DNA variation, but it's not there anymore. So these scores are not nearly predictive of them. And despite all the concerns about racial differences, ancestral differences, they're saying, what about us? How come we're excluded? And so there are projects now in the United States to try and get this genome information on minority groups for that reason. So I think these things don't happen suddenly. And I sort of agree, sometimes it's maybe better to know, but who do you want to tell you this is not good for you to know, little boy?
Yes.
You know, I think you should be able to make the decision. And it's hard, but I think it's just so great we have this exciting, important knowledge that can be used for good or bad. It might not be comfortable for you, but you know, it's important and it makes a difference in society. And I would rather make decisions about myself than to have some administrator or worse, insurance person decide whether or not I ought to know about something.
Yeah. Who would not sit in a Ferrari if you can drive a Ferrari, and your reaction is much more connected to, I don't know, to a Ford Escort or whatever. So this is how I feel about this one. Like you are jumping in the Ferrari, but are we ready for that one? Again, technology advanced, and I'm not sure whether our mind not advanced. I feel like you are talking with me, you are the guy from the future, you know, coming back and telling me things that most of the people around me, well-educated people live in my neighborhood, to be honest, they don't know about it.
Yeah, but you know, as I said, that's the reason I wrote my book, Blueprint, because it isn't the future, it's happening now. I mean, nearly 30 million people have worked with these direct-to-consumer companies to get their DNA testing done. National health services are beginning to do this. This really is happening now. And so, like it or not, you're going to have to decide how you feel about it. And
I can imagine in 50 years. Sorry.
There's a lot of people though who worry about all these things. You know, they're doom mongers. You know, all the bad things that could happen. And I understand. You know, there could be labeling effects. You know, that sort of thing. But I see so many advantages coming out of it that's why I'm a cheerleader for it. I say, okay, yeah, there's no big advances are, you know, all totally good. They can be used for good or bad. And we could worry about protection of data. You know, that's a major concern with big data. What if insurance companies got this information, whatever? Lots of things to worry about. But I'd also say it's a no-brainer from a medical prevention point of view. We want to prevent these problems from occurring.
And that's the most important.
Waiting until they happen. So I just want to highlight the good for people so that it encourages them to think about doing this and extracting the good from it. And as much as possible, leaving behind the bad possibilities.
Yeah, actually, this is what we are doing. I can imagine that in 50 years, I'm not sure I'm going to be alive in 50 years, or in 30 years or so, my grandchildren will be asking, oh, granddad, you were living when there was the DNA revolution. I may say, yes, I know, but some people will say, I didn't know that that was happening actually around. It's not, you know, in some years, it's going to be maybe much more obvious. When you're in it, it's not always that obvious. Obviously, information technology, AI. I think AI will be very important with this one because you cannot count with your computer. You need much more computing power for this kind of polygenic score computing, I guess. So I'm not, of course, familiar with this part, but I'm sure that we will use it. Okay, we flew away from this topic. I just wanted to mention these things because I think it's important, and we will need people who are getting the knowledge out of your book and your colleagues' books and papers and translate it to an even much more easier to understand way. Sentences, maybe just pages, etc., because I'm sure that it's still too complex for most of the people. Maybe this discussion, even what we just had now.
Yeah, it's a slow process for sure, but you certainly hear about it's in the genes, it's in the DNA. I mean, DNA is a topic now.
Yes.
And we didn't even get into gene editing, but of course you see that every other week in the newspaper, for example. So more and more you see gene, DNA, and I think people start saying, wow, this is really happening. What is this about?
But actually, the gene editing part, and when we talk about the moral part, it's more or less the same question. If by gene editing, you can have, I don't know, no diseases, except, of course, it's not black or white, but this is the reason. The reason is you want to have a much more, I don't know, nice face and much more smaller nose. Well, is it okay or it's not okay? So again, these are the questions of much more moral things, I guess. It's not a technological question.
Yeah, well, I think gene editing has been greatly exaggerated in terms of what it can do. I mean, for single gene disorders, that is a really important way to think about it. Now, you might think it's more advantageous to do in vitro fertilization and screening embryos than changing an egg. Because, you think about it, we've got trillions of cells. You're not going to edit all trillions of cells. So the reason cystic fibrosis, which is a single gene disorder, the only reason people tried to do that with single gene editing is that we know where it is. It's in the lung, and we can get stuff into the lung. And so we can put a good gene in to replace the bad gene. But what about stuff in your brain? You can't. How are you going to do that? There are billions of cells, So the only way you can do it is at the first stage, an egg and a sperm, and you could change them. But why not select them instead? And when people think you're going to change things like beauty and hair color, well, wait, we're talking about thousands and thousands of cells. You're not going to change all those cells. So unless you change things very early in life, like at the sperm and egg level, I don't see how this is going to happen.
Yeah, I think we have technology. We'll see whether we will be wise enough to use it well. If I look back, sometimes yes, the answer is sometimes no. I'm optimistic today, but by definition, I would say. So, but this is my way of thinking, but not everybody's like that, for sure. So we can see. Robert, we covered lots of things today, but one thing I want to ask, what's coming? What's your plans for future? What books will we be able to read what you're writing? Hopefully you're doing something like this that will be available for us who are interested in your work. What's the things that you are working on now?
Well, I've got some great students, and the field is so exciting. I'm not able to think about retirement because I've been waiting all these decades for this.
No way. Yeah, no way.
Wanting to see where it goes, and there's so much happening. It's kind of hard to predict the future. I did write a paper that just came out called "The Next 10 Years of Behavioral Genomics," but it's mostly in the area of psychiatry and how the new genetics, the DNA revolution, is going to change the way we do research in these areas. So I'm interested in those sorts of topics. But it's like a kid in a candy shop. There's so many things to do, and so I'm working on a lot of different things. I mean, the single biggest thing we want to do is to narrow the gap in missing heritability. That is, although we can explain a lot of the variants, the heritability with known DNA polygenic scores, there's still a long way to go. And most people believe that once we have whole genome sequence, that is not SNP chips that measure hundreds of thousands of DNA differences, but you sequence all 3 billion base pairs of DNA, and that's the end of the story. That's all there is. So we ought to be able to pick up more of the DNA variants to make these scores more predictive. But you could say they're amazingly predictive already, often predicting outcomes better than our traditional predictors, even though we've only been doing this for 10 years. So it's just such an exciting field, and there isn't any one thing I'm doing. I'm trying not to write another book, frankly.
You're trying not to write? What does it mean that you're trying not to write?
About a dozen books, and it's fun writing a book because it's there, it's for a long time. In contrast, writing journal articles, it's a different type of writing. It's so focused, and you can't discuss things, and I don't know, they're fun in a way, they come and go quickly. But a book is nice because it's like having a lover, you just hang in there year. They take a long time.
Yes.
And it's great if you say, I'm going to give it the time it needs. I'm not going to get this done because some student has to get a PhD done. It'll take the time it takes to do it. And it's just always there. It's kind of like a steady rock in your life. So I love writing books, but people don't read books. You have much more, they don't. I mean, they read blueprints, so that's good. But you have to write a book that's, as you pointed out, isn't really a popular book in the sense it's not really a low-level airplane, airport type book.
No.
But it's as low as I could go. And it's not what I like to do. I mean, some people, they want to just communicate stuff at the most basic level.
Mhm.
And there are writers that could do that. And I think there's a lot of room in this area for such writers. But that's not me. I like being up at that more intellectual level. Not because I'm a snob, but that's where the science is, you know? So that's
You just grew into your gene, right?
Yeah, I think that's right, really. I mean, it's important in life to find out what you like to do and what you're good at. It's very important as parents that that's what we find out about our kids. We don't make them into what we want them to be. We find out what they want to be, what they're good at, and you help them do that. And it's the same for ourselves. It's good to pay attention to, well, what do we enjoy doing? What gives us pleasure? And the big individual differences. Not everybody gets pleasure from the sorts of things that give us pleasure. But I know what I like to do. I mean, a good day for me is when I just write and work and think and read, and I don't have any meetings.
Okay. Like this. Okay.
No, it's very enjoyable talking about this stuff with you.
Yeah, I keep reminding myself of, I have 2 kids with these ideas where I just learned from you and from your book and this way of thinking, because it helps me, to be honest, really, really, because they are still young, so they live with us, with my wife and me. So thank you very much for this one. Okay, no books. We will read your papers. That's okay, because you just wrote the last 100 years of genetics. Now the next 10 years of genetics. So there are things to read.
Podcasts are the way of the future.
Yeah.
I mean, really, people aren't going to read newspapers anymore, are they? Most young people, they don't know what a newspaper is. They read everything online. And don't you think eventually books, you know, they're going to be audiobooks maybe, but with shorter attention spans, I think podcasts are the future.
So let's keep on doing these things and let's meet somewhere in the future.
Good.
Thank you very much.
It's so nice talking to you. Good luck with your podcast.
Thank you very much.